joined Fletcher a year after the last book ended. He's back where he began, in the little village of Pelt. More specifically, under it in a dark prison cell. A lot has changed in the year he's been locked away. Diedrich is now a noble with his own demon, and the lord of Pelt prison. The situation with the dwarves is degraded, and revolt looms on the horizon, and the alliance with the elves is on the brink of collapse. The war with the orcs is also on the backslide, with the introduction of goblins. Magical crosses between small, nimble gremlins and powerful orcs. The only option to stop the birth of these abominations before they overrun Humenum is to go behind enemy lines. The king sees an opportunity to improve race relations by showing humans, dwarves, and elves united against the orcs. Fletcher is the perfect human for the job, with Othello and Silva at his side. But they aren't putting all their eggs in one basket. 3 other teams will be going as well, and they include old enemies that want Fletcher dead and the alliance to fall. Behind enemy lines, things get complicated. Someone is trying to kill him, and there are too many suspects. The last book was good. This one is great. Let's start with the titular Inquisition. It really doesn't take up that much of the story, but serves to set up the world after Fletcher's year of imprisonment. Diedrich's father has succeeded in turning Pelt into a prison camp and evicting the residents from their homes. In the process, he became a lord, and is now in alliance with Lord Forsyth, Lady Favisham, to form the Triumvirate. Together, they run the majority of the prisons and weapons manufacturing of the country. This makes them both pro-war and anti-dwarf. The trial is actually 2 separate trials. The first is Fletcher's trial for the attempted murder of Diedrich that set his story in motion, with the defense having a year to prepare. The second is sprung just moments after the first ends, accusing both Fletcher and Othello of treason, stemming from events in the first book. This is the Triumvirate's true aim. While killing Fletcher would be a nice bonus and a balm on Diedrich's ego, having Othello, the first dwarven summoner, executed for treason in a sham trial would push the dwarves to revolt. This would give them cause to seize all the dwarven firearm assets and jail them en masse, leaving the Triumvirate with the entire weapons market and full prisons. And all this with the backing of old King Alfred. While it is King Harold who sits on the throne, it is his father Alfred who wields the true power through his alliance with the nobles. The old politicians using their power to oppress marginalized group isn't even thinly veiled symbolism for current events. King Harold tells Fletcher the only way to prevent war and save his friend is to confess to treason. Considering what happened next, I wonder how much he really knows about past events. During the course of the trial, it is revealed that Fletcher is of noble birth. This is fairly common fantasy trope and was implied in the previous book, though he isn't part of the family we were originally led to believe. This gives Fletcher, and by extension King Harold, a vote on the council. With Fletcher's support, King Harold enacts a plan in hopes of pulling the country together and uniting the races against the common threat of the orcs. Teams of summoners will be sent behind enemy lines to find and destroy the orcs' newest weapon, goblins. Joining this expedition will be Silva, to represent the elves, and 3 dwarven summoners, Othello, his brother Attila, and a female dwarf named Cress. Powerful demons, borrowed from some of the nobles, will go along as aid, and magically transmit everything back to Humenum through scrying crystals, so the population can follow the mission in real time. More importantly, so they can see humans, dwarves, and elves working together. The theme of this book and this series is racism. In the first book, we learned that dwarves were the original inhabitants of Humenum, sharing with humans when they first arrived, but slowly, over generations, being forced from their homes and into ghettos. With the invention of the gun, they're making headway in society, but it is a small step, and an uphill battle. The more immediate problem is the anvil. Mentioned briefly in the previous book, it was a group of dwarves and humans who were seeking more positive relations between the races. But recently, some of the group members have turned violent, setting off bombs and causing several casualties, all blamed on the dwarves. This has worsened relations over the last year, sparking violent protests against the dwarves, and even more restrictions on their lives. The elves, meanwhile, have withdrawn from Humenum. At the end of the last book, Silva returned home, injured from the tournament. While they have not declared open war, relations have not improved. This has given Diedrich the excuse he needs to bring more troops to Pelt and fortify his position, literally and figuratively. Fletcher is of course tasked with leading the multi-race group of himself, Othello, Silva, Cress, and a young human alchemist named Geoffrey. Their journey through the jungle is enlightening. Previously, the orcs were framed only as antagonists, dumb brutes that kept little gremlins as slaves and sought only to destroy Hominum because it was there. Instead, they are a complex society based on the Mayans and Aztecs. They believe that every 100 years an albino orc is born who will lead them to rule the world. Young male orc are rounded up and forced into brutal training, culminating in a series of sporting events to decide the favor of the gods. Those that do not win are ritually sacrificed, their blood used to open a portal to the ether and create the goblins. This is a nice change. So often orcs are just mooks for the hero to murder on their way to the big bad. This puts all the races on an even field. No one race is evil or good. They all have their own aims, and they are all populated by innocent bystanders caught between the powers that be. The racism in this series takes 3 forms. The institutionalized racism against the dwarves, the general othering against the elves, and the full-on war with the orcs. I love to see important and complex issues dealt with in fiction. Racism, homophobia, and bigotry are tough topics to tackle. It is easy to say you should not hate someone for their skin color, but people are a social species, and we tend towards tribalism. The biggest problem is institutionalized racism. These are the little wounds inflicted every day without thought. Hollywood often depicts African Americans as inner-city thugs, so even someone who has never met a person of color has already formed an idea of how they should act, even if they consciously know it's only a stereotype. In 1945, post-World War II, America started the process of suburbanization. Driven largely by the government, these suburbs were almost exclusively white by design, and the results are evident even to this day. This creates schools that are segregated simply by drawing the districts along certain lines. The wealthier, largely white suburban districts have more property taxes, which in turn goes to better schools and providing better education that leads to more opportunities. Conversely, districts that are poorer and largely populated by people of color have less revenue to put into schools and end up providing poor education that lead to fewer opportunities. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But even when you point this out, people are quick to reach for personal experience. My own father tells the story of his childhood when black children would steal from his parents' store. His family was considered poor, but it never occurred to him, even to this day, that those children were poorer still. It is a formative experience he will never overcome. However, in a world of fantasy, these personal experiences can be extracted and pushed aside. Talking about relations between elves and dwarves can put otherwise emotional issues into simpler terms. It is a great way for young readers to learn empathy and see the scale of the problem without the emotional attachments getting in the way. The same applies to the orcs. It is easy to see a bully as big and dumb and mean instead of a victim in their own right. The orcs are following their religious beliefs. They believe they are doing the will of their gods, not unlike American Christians who believe that LGBT people should be put to death because the Bible says so. There is also a quick moment of religious discrimination between the dwarves. Female dwarves traditionally wear veils outside the home and in the presence of unrelated men. Cress chooses not to wear hers. Attila criticizes her choice, calling her immodest. She retorts that it's not required and a choice each dwarven woman makes for herself. He has no say in her choice to wear a veil or not. She even goes so far as to point out that he does not cover his face and often trains shirtless, but it is not considered immodest. The allegory here is wonderfully pointed. I put this on my top shelf. It is a fun story full of action and adventure. The theme of racism gives the story a nice weight while putting important issues into an easily digestible form. Thank you for your time. I know everyone's mileage will vary. Feel free to leave your thoughts.